Hi everybody. I want to start launching off today's classroom, which we're doing online, by just talking a little bit openly and sharing some of my joys and frustrations about teaching this particular class. And I don't mean you guys in particular, I mean the class CRD 302, Inclusive Community Development. I, as you know, have organized the class structure around the social determinants of health because access to education and health care and adequate food and transportation, the ability to get around, and all of the kinds of things that the social determinants of health are basically the basic things that everybody needs for them to live, not a amazingly ostentatious life, but a life that is full and with well-being. And everybody wants that. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. Everybody wants those basic things in their life: the ability to go to the doctor if they get sick, the ability to know that there's going to be food on the table, the ability for our children and ourselves actually to get a good education and places to play, and so on and so forth. So what we've been looking at is the ways in which society structured these infrastructure things that we all need in order to have a decent life, and the ways that our institutions and our structures are not always fully inclusive, and in fact some people get excluded. And I think it's pretty obvious to people when we just look at numbers. We've looked at numbers a couple of times this semester. We looked at some numbers about who was getting education, and we even looked at actually the ASU enrollment numbers. We looked at some numbers around childbirth and mortality in childbirth, women dying in childbirth. And we saw that there were some discrepancies by social identity group. And when we talk about these discrepancies in terms of the social determinants of health, when we talk about the ways in which our educational institutions were created during a time when basically it was a patriarchal society, and certain things, although we've changed a lot of things up to make them more inclusive, we're very good at recruiting all different kinds of people and genders and so forth. There are things that we don't even realize are baked into our system. And I think maybe at one point I used the example of the criteria for scholarships, which is still very old and kind of favors a white patriarchal, not so much patriarchal anymore, but a typical white set of experiences that show up on those applications. And we don't always stop to think about that. I don't know if this semester I told a story that our dean, Dean Capel, actually told to me and several other people around a table at our college's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. But he was telling a story of being on a hiring panel, and there were 3 people on the hiring panel. 2 were Caucasian, and 1 was a man from another culture. I can't remember what country he said he was from, but as the panel began asking questions, they realized that the 2 Caucasians were answering the questions in a very linear Western way of doing it. They would just, if they asked, what is your past experience with blah, 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 these 2 Caucasians would basically say, well, I did this, and I did that, and I worked here, and I worked there, and we accomplished this. When those exact same questions were asked to the person from another country who came from an Eastern culture, that person began answering every question with a contextual story, a story from his family or his life or his work, and did not directly answer the question. And Dean Capel actually was able to sort of meta-reflect on what was going on. He saw the other colleagues on the hiring committee getting frustrated because they weren't getting these expected answers. And he realized that this was a cultural discrepancy, and he felt that this particular person, however good he might be at doing the job, was going to be penalized because of the cultural way in which he answered questions, because the typical thing that we're used to is a particular way. And so even though we try to talk about how much we love diversity, diversity without inclusion, by which we mean full access and opportunity and ability to take advantage of the things that are there, diversity without inclusion is almost useless. It means that people like the guy who interviewed and came at answering questions from a different cultural perspective, ultimately would never probably be able to do much more than stand in the room where we're diverse now. He could stand in the room, but he wouldn't be able to participate. And Dean Capel said that he pushed to have this guy put ahead into the next round of the interviews, but where the same thing happened and he wasn't on the hiring committee and the guy fell off the committee. And he was just sharing with us that if we're going to truly be an inclusive society, then we have to find ways to do things that honor all of the differences that we have. And that was a really good example, I thought, of a situation where nobody intended to discriminate against this guy, but our cultural way of doing something just in fact did. So most of the students are okay with these conversations. The conversations in this class start getting difficult when we get down to talking about bias and prejudice. And interestingly enough, in this particular semester, I felt like I was seeing something new that I hadn't seen before. In the past, even when people had differences of opinion, and even when the conversations were somewhat uncomfortable, the thing that I witnessed a lot of was people just agreeing to disagree. I might think that microaggressions do have the possibility of, small inflicted, even unintentionally inflicted criticisms for whatever. I'm not particularly talking racial here, although that's how it gets talked about the most. But I think that small, unintentional, or joking even insults repeated over and over again makes people feel small. And we don't have to look at racial microaggressions to see that. We can look in the area of domestic violence, where one of the typical ways that's been studied of how an abuser makes their abused spouse or partner feel badly is by saying little zings every day that make them feel small. And after a while, and there's probably more going on than just the zings, but that is a part of it. And after a while, these little insults begin to work on the person who they are directed, until they begin to wonder about their own value. And so, that's my view on microaggressions, even knowing that oftentimes people say things that they didn't mean. I read or heard, I can't remember if it was on YouTube or Facebook or in a magazine article, but there was a discussion about a guy who had to step down from something because he used the phrase cotton picking. Cotton picking is obviously a thing that slaves used to do, but between now, or whenever we started being more aware of using language like that, we changed the name of what used to be Squaw Peak Freeway. We renamed it after Pièce de Wa, the young woman who was the first Arizona casualty in the Afghan war under Bush, and we changed the name Squaw Peak to Pièce de Wa Peak, and so forth. Before we started becoming more sensitive to our use of words and whether or not they were derogatory, excuse me, the term cotton picking meant gosh darn, or can you believe it? And people just used it. It was just part of language. And the fellow who had to step down from whatever he was doing for using the term was older. And I'm sure he grew up with that having absolutely no connection in his mind between slavery and the kind of agricultural work that slaves were forced to do. And his use of this term, it was just a term in his vernacular. I can't remember where I was going with that. Anyway,